There is a cave in South Dakota that breathes. Air rushes out of a hole in the ground hard enough to knock a grown man's hat off his head. And hours later, that same hole pulls the air back in, like a lung set into the earth itself. The Lakota named it centuries before any scientist explained why. They called it Maka Oniye, the breathing earth, and they said it was the place where their people first walked up out of the ground into the world. In 1868, the United States signed a treaty promising this land, the entire Black Hills, to the Lakota forever in writing, with the full weight of federal law behind it. 6 years later, gold turned that promise into a lie. And in 1980, when the government finally admitted what it had done and tried to pay for it, the Lakota said no. They have kept saying no for over 40 years, while the check the government tried to write them has quietly grown past $1 billion. If you're already asking yourself whether you'd take the money or hold out for the land, hit like and subscribe before we get into it, and drop a comment telling me which side of that decision you'd be on. This is the story of what that land actually meant and why no amount of money has ever been enough to buy it. Long before Custer, before the treaty, before any of it, the Lakota told a story about where their people came from, and it did not begin on the surface of the earth. It began underneath it. In the oral tradition passed down through generations, the first Lakota lived below ground in a spirit world, waiting for the surface to become ready for them. A man named Tokahe led them up through a narrow passage, stopping 4 times along the way to rest and pray, which is why the number 4 still carries weight in Lakota ceremony today. When they emerged, the buffalo came with them, and that shared emergence is why the Lakota described their bond with the buffalo as something closer to kinship than to hunting. The passage they emerged through was real, and you can still walk into it. It is Wind Cave in the southern Black Hills, and the Lakota name for it, Maka Oniya, translates directly to breathing earth. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. That name is not a metaphor. Wind Cave genuinely breathes. Its only natural opening is small, but the cave system behind it is enormous, one of the densest and most complex on the planet. And when a storm drops, the air pressure outside, high-pressure air stored inside the cave, rushes out through that opening fast enough to be felt as wind. When the pressure rises again, the cave pulls the air back in. 19th century settlers who stumbled onto the hole described their hats being blown clean off. It took modern barometric science to explain what the Lakota had already built into their origin story, that the earth, in this one specific place, behaves as though it is inhaling and exhaling. This is the detail most people miss when they hear sacred land and picture only scenery. The Lakota were not calling the Black Hills holy because the pine forests were pretty against the granite. They were describing a place where something measurable and strange was actually happening underground. A phenomenon so specific that their name for it, recorded generations before any geologist studied barometric cave systems, turned out to be functionally accurate. Paha Sapa, their name for the whole range, means something close to the heart of everything that is. Not a heart in the poetic sense, a heart in the sense of an organ, something that pumps, something the rest of the body depends on to keep functioning. Keep that image in mind, because it explains everything that follows, including why a check for over $1 billion still sits uncashed in a federal account today. By 1868, the United States government had a problem, and the problem was named Red Cloud. The Oglala Lakota leader had spent 2 years fighting federal troops along the Bozeman Trail, and he was winning badly enough that Washington eventually agreed to abandon its forts and negotiate. What came out of that negotiation was the Fort Laramie Treaty, and its language regarding the Black Hills was not vague or ceremonial. Article 2 of the treaty set aside the Great Sioux Reservation, the Black Hills included, for what the document itself calls the absolute and undisturbed use and occupation of the Indians. Not shared use, not temporary use, absolute and undisturbed. The treaty went further than most agreements of its era, and this is the part that matters most for everything that happens next. It specified that no future cession of any part of that reservation would be valid unless it was signed by at least 3/4 of the adult Lakota men living on the land. That threshold was not decorative language. It was a legal safeguard built directly into the treaty text, designed specifically to prevent the government from picking off a small, pressured minority and calling it consent for the whole nation. Whoever drafted that clause understood exactly how these agreements tended to unravel and tried to build a wall against it in advance. For a few years, the wall held. The Black Hills were closed to white settlement, at least on paper, and the treaty stood as one of the more explicit legal commitments the federal government had ever made to any tribal nation. What nobody in 1868 could have predicted was that the wall would not be broken by an army. It would be broken by a rumor, and then by a newspaper headline, and then by roughly 1,000 soldiers riding in under orders that technically had nothing to do with gold at all. The man leading them had just spent the Civil War building a reputation for moving fast and asking questions later, and in the summer of 1874, he pointed that instinct directly at the one place the United States had promised, on paper, to leave alone. George Armstrong Custer left Fort Abraham Lincoln on July 2, 1874, with more than 1,000 men, a 16-piece mounted band, and, officially, a mission that had nothing to do with treasure. His orders were to scout locations for a future Army fort and assess the region for a possible road, all inside land the United States had legally promised to the Lakota 6 years earlier. What Custer also brought in direct tension with the spirit of that treaty were newspaper correspondents and 2 civilian miners, men whose entire job was to look for exactly one thing. On August 2nd, in a stream that would later be named French Creek, prospector Horatio Ross panned a small amount of gold flake from the creek bed. It was not a fortune. Soldiers who kept diaries during the expedition barely mentioned it, and not a single member of the 1,000-man column left camp to go stake a claim. Custer himself was careful in his official report, noting only that miners had found gold in what might be commercial quantities. But careful was not what he sent to the newspapers riding with him, and it is not what went out over the telegraph wire from Fort Laramie. The Bismarck Tribune ran the headline the country wanted, one word, in capital letters, gold. That single dispatch did more damage to the Fort Laramie Treaty than any army ever could have. Within months, prospectors were pouring into the Black Hills by the thousands, walking directly onto land the federal government had sworn, in writing, was reserved exclusively for the Lakota. The government's official response was to occasionally, half-heartedly, threaten to remove the trespassers. Its real response was silence, because Washington now had a gold rush on land it desperately wanted and a legal promise standing directly in the way of taking it. What happened next would not come through honest renegotiation. It would come through starvation, engineered specifically to force the Lakota into giving up what the treaty said could never be taken from them at all. Here's the piece of this story that tends to get left out, and it is the piece that turns a broken promise into something closer to extortion. Under the 1868 treaty, the Lakota were entitled to federal subsistence rations, an obligation the government had taken on partly because its own policies had already devastated the buffalo herds the tribes depended on. Those ration guarantees had technically expired in 1872, but Congress kept appropriating the money anyway, year after year, because cutting off food to thousands of people tends to have consequences that even a hostile Congress could see coming. Then, in August of 1876, with prospectors already flooding illegally into the Black Hills and gold fever gripping the country, Congress passed an Appropriations Act with a specific and deliberate condition attached. There would be no more subsistence funding for the Lakota, none at all, unless they first agreed to give up their hunting rights outside the reservation and formally cede the Black Hills to the United States. This was not subtle pressure applied at a negotiating table. This was the federal government using food as a lever against people it had already promised to feed in order to extract a consent the original treaty had specifically tried to make impossible to fake. The agreement that followed, if it can even be called that, was signed by roughly 10% of the adult Lakota men living on the reservation, nowhere close to the 3/4 threshold the 1868 treaty required. Congress passed it into law anyway, as the Act of February 28, 1877, stripping away more than 7 million acres, the entire Black Hills included. In exchange, the Lakota were offered rations of beef, flour, and coffee until the Indians are able to support themselves, with new conditions attached requiring children to attend government schools and adults to take up farming. Nobody involved in drafting that act, not a single congressman, ever seriously argued that beef and flour represented fair payment for the richest gold-bearing mountain range on the continent. The theft was not disputed by anyone in power. It was simply finalized, and it would take the Lakota more than a century and 3 separate rounds of federal litigation to get anyone in a courtroom to say so out loud. The Lakota did not accept the 1877 seizure quietly, but for decades they had no legal door to walk through. Congress alone controlled whether tribes could even sue the United States, and it was not until 1920, after intense lobbying, that lawmakers finally authorized the Sioux to bring a claim in the Court of Claims. What followed reads less like a single lawsuit and more like a legal siege spanning 3 generations. The case bounced between the Court of Claims and a body called the Indian Claims Commission, got dismissed once in 1942 on a technicality that had nothing to do with whether the seizure was fair, got resubmitted after Congress created the Indian Claims Commission Act in 1946, and stalled again over a legal doctrine called res judicata, essentially a ruling that the 1942 dismissal had already closed the door for good. The door finally cracked open in 1978 when Congress passed a special act ordering the Court of Claims to review the entire question from scratch without regard to any of the earlier rulings against the Lakota. This time, the court did not equivocate. It affirmed what tribal leaders had been saying since 1877. The seizure of the Black Hills had been carried out through, in the court's own words, a course of unfair and dishonorable dealing. The government appealed that finding all the way to the Supreme Court, and on June 30, 1980, in United States versus Sioux Nation of Indians, the justices ruled 8-1 against the government. Justice Harry Blackmun, writing for the majority, called it a more ripe and rank case of dishonorable dealings than the court was likely to see again. The award came to $106 million, the largest sum any court had ever ordered paid to a Native American tribe, built from the $17.1 million value of the land in 1877, plus a century of accumulated interest. It was, by every legal measure, a total vindication. And 9 days later, on July 9, 1980, the Sioux Tribal Council voted unanimously to refuse every dollar of it. To understand why anyone turns down $106 million, you have to understand what accepting it would have actually meant. Under the terms of the ruling, taking the payment would have functioned as a legal settlement, closing the door permanently on any future claim to the land itself. The money was never really the argument. Mario Gonzalez, one of the attorneys who represented the tribe, has explained the calculation plainly. Accepting the payment meant forfeiting all claims to the Black Hills forever. For a nation whose origin story begins with people walking up out of that exact ground, that was never a trade worth making. So the money sat, and it sat in a federal trust account still drawing interest, year after year, decade after decade, while the people who refused it remained among the poorest communities in the country. By 2011, that untouched balance had crossed $1 billion. More recent accounts place it at roughly $2 billion, a fortune nobody has ever spent, growing quietly in a government ledger while Pine Ridge and other Lakota reservations continue to face some of the highest poverty rates in the United States. That contradiction, wealth accumulating on paper while people go without, is not an accident of bureaucracy. It is the entire point the refusal was designed to make. And underneath the hills themselves, something else has continued, almost as if in answer to the Lakota's original claim about what that ground actually holds. The old Homestake gold mine, the same vein of ore that helped justify tearing up a federal treaty, closed for good in 2001 after producing roughly 40 million ounces of gold. Today, physicists work in that same mine shaft, nearly a mile beneath the Black Hills, hunting for dark matter, the invisible material that holds galaxies together, using detectors built in total darkness, precisely because the Earth above them blocks out every form of interference that would ruin the search. Scientists are once again looking for something unseen, running through the ground beneath Paha Sapa. The Lakota said the hills held something beneath the surface long before anyone else thought to check. They have never needed $1 billion to prove they were right. The check is still sitting there, uncashed, and the Earth is still breathing.